The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, just as I was sanding a cedar plank in my workshop, the air thick with the sweet smell of wood shavings. My hands, rough from decades of shaping timber, froze when I heard the doctor's voice on the other end. "Mr. Hayes, I'm terribly sorry to tell you this. Your son, Nathan, was in a plane crash this morning. He didn't make it." The words hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. Nathan, my boy, gone at 45, my only child. I dropped the sandpaper, and it fluttered to the floor like a leaf in a Georgia autumn. The workshop, my sanctuary for years, felt like it was closing in, the walls echoing with memories of Nathan as a boy, hammering nails beside me, his small hands trying to mimic mine. "Mr. Hayes, are you there?" the doctor asked, his voice distant, like it was coming from another world. "I'm here," I managed, my throat tight. "What happened?" "It was his private plane. Went down just after takeoff. They did everything they could, but he was gone before they reached him. Gone." The word stuck in my mind, sharp and cold. I sank onto an old wooden stool, staring at the workbench where a half-finished rocking chair sat, a project Nathan had once begged to help with when he was 10. I could still see his gap-toothed grin, so proud when he drove his first nail straight. "When did it happen?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Around 7 this morning. His assistant found the wreckage." "I'm so sorry, Mr. Hayes. We'll need someone to make arrangements. Is there family we should contact?" "His wife, Sophia," I said, the name tasting like sawdust in my mouth. "I'll call her." I hung up and sat there, the Georgia sun, filtering through the workshop's open door, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Everything looked the same as it had an hour ago. Tools neatly hung, wood stacked in the corner, a faded photo of Nathan pinned to the wall, but nothing felt right. My boy was gone. I reached for my phone again, hands trembling as I dialed Sophia's number. It went straight to voicemail, her polished voice crisp and professional. "You've reached Sophia Grant. I'm unavailable, but leave a detailed message, and I'll return your call when I can." Even her voicemail felt like a wall between us. "Sophia, it's Walter. I just heard about Nathan. Please call me back. We need to talk about arrangements." I waited 20 minutes, then tried again. Same result. An hour later I called, a third time, then a fourth. By the fifth, my voice was shaking, a mix of grief and frustration. "Sophia, this is Walter again. I know we've never seen eye to eye, but this is about Nathan. Please, just call me." Nothing. Silence. I stared at the photo on the wall, Nathan at 12, holding a wooden birdhouse we'd built together. His eyes sparkled with pride, his smile wide enough to light up the whole workshop. That was before he left for New York, before he built his empire in private aviation, before Sophia came into his life and decided I didn't belong in theirs. I don't know how long I sat there, the phone heavy in my hand. The afternoon heat pressed in, and the cicadas outside hummed, their endless song. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the photo from the wall, its frame worn from years of dust and handling, and tucked it into my pocket. Nathan was my son. I wasn't going to let Sophia shut me out of saying goodbye. I pulled an old canvas duffel from the closet, stuffing it with a few changes of clothes, my shaving kit, and a small wooden box Nathan had carved when he was a teenager. My hands moved on their own, like they were trying to outrun the pain in my chest. I kept seeing Nathan's face, not the successful man in tailored suits, but the boy who'd spent summers in this workshop, asking me how to make the perfect dovetail joint. I tried Sophia one last time. Voicemail again. This time, I didn't leave a message. I set the phone down, my hands balling into fists. Enough was enough. I wasn't going to sit here in Georgia, waiting for her to decide I was worth her time. As I packed, my neighbor, Mrs. Carter, peeked through her window across the yard, her face creased with worry. I gave her a nod, but didn't stop to explain. How do you tell someone your world just fell apart? The drive to New York would take 14 hours if I pushed it. I'd done it once before, years ago, when Nathan graduated from business school. Back then, Sophia had at least pretended to tolerate me. Now, I wasn't so sure. I folded the photo of Nathan carefully into my bag, the glass frame catching the light. There was a small chip in one corner from when I'd dropped it years ago, meaning to fix it but never getting around to it. Regret gnawed at me. So many things I meant to do, meant to say. Outside, the sun was dipping low, painting the Georgia sky in shades of orange and pink. I locked the workshop, the click of the padlock sounding final, like a door closing on a life I'd never get back. Tomorrow, I'd head north to a city that felt like another planet, to a son I'd never see again, and to a daughter-in-law who wished I'd disappear. But tonight, I sat on the porch, the photo of Nathan in my hands, and let the tears come. I cried for the boy who'd carved that birdhouse, for the man he'd become, and for all the years we'd let slip away. The next morning, I climbed into my old pickup, the engine coughing to life like it was as reluctant as I was. Mrs. Carter waved from her porch, but I just tipped my cap and pulled onto the road. Interstate 95 stretched out ahead, a long ribbon of asphalt leading me to a place I didn't belong. 14 hours of driving, with nothing but my thoughts and the ghosts of conversations I'd never have with Nathan again. I reached for the radio, then stopped. Silence felt right, like it was the only thing honest enough for this moment. Somewhere outside South Carolina, a memory hit me like a freight train. Nathan, maybe 8 years old, standing in the workshop with sawdust in his hair, holding up a crooked wooden box he'd made. "Look, Dad, it's from Mom's jewelry," he'd said, beaming. My late wife, Ellen, had laughed and hugged him, saying it was the prettiest box she'd ever seen. I'd knelt beside him, showing him how to sand the edges smoother. "Keep at it, son. You'll make something perfect one day." He'd nodded, his small face serious, like he was taking on the world. When had we stopped building things together? When had he gotten too busy for his old man? I pulled over at a rest stop, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The grief was a living thing, clawing at my chest. I didn't know how to do this, how to bury my son, how to face Sophia, how to live in a world where Nathan wasn't. A young gas station attendant, maybe 20, noticed me sitting there. "You okay, sir?" he asked, his eyes kind in a way that reminded me of Nathan at that age. "Headed to New York," I said, my voice rough. "To see my son." Too late, though. His face softened. "I'm sorry. Drive safe, all right?" I nodded and got back on the road. The miles blurred by, each one taking me closer to Nathan's world and further from the life I understood. The highway stretched out like a promise I wasn't sure I wanted to keep. 14 hours from Georgia to New York, my old pickup rattling. Along Interstate 95, the engine humming a low, steady song that couldn't drown out the ache in my chest. I'd driven this route once before, years ago, for Nathan's business school graduation. Back then, I'd been proud as hell watching my boy walk across that stage, his grin bright enough to light up the whole auditorium. Sophia had been there too, all smiles and charm. shaking my hand like we were going to be family forever. How things change. Now the road felt endless, each mile marker a reminder of how far apart Nathan and I had grown. The photo of him, that 12-year-old kid with the birdhouse, sat on the passenger seat, its chipped frame catching the sunlight. I kept glancing at it, like it could somehow bring him back. Somewhere in North Carolina, the hum of the tires pulled a memory loose. Nathan at 10, tagging along with me to a client's house to deliver a dining table I'd built. He'd carried my toolbox, too heavy for his skinny arms, but he wouldn't let me take it from him. "I got it, Dad," he'd said, stubborn as a mule. When we got there, the client, old Mr. Jenkins, raved about the table's craftsmanship, and Nathan puffed, up like he'd built it himself. "Will I make stuff like you someday?" he'd asked on the drive home, his voice full of that kid-like certainty that the future was his to shape. "You'll make something even better," I'd told him, ruffling his hair. "Just keep your hands steady and your heart true." I hadn't known then that better would mean private jets and a penthouse in Manhattan, a world so far from my workshop I could barely picture it. When had I stopped understanding the man he'd become? The road blurred through my tears, and I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. No use crying now. I had to get to New York, had to see this through for Nathan. By the time I hit Virginia, the sun was high, and the radio was spitting out traffic reports for cities I'd never see. I left it off. Silence was better, letting me sink into memories that felt like all I had left of my boy. Another one came, sharp and vivid. Nathan, at 16, helping me in the workshop during a summer storm. Rain pounded the roof, and we were carving a set of chairs for a church fundraiser. He'd been quiet that day, not his usual chatterbox self. "Dad," he'd said finally, looking up from his chisel, "you ever think about leaving Georgia, seeing the world?" I'd laughed, thinking he was joking. "What's out there better than this? We got wood, tools, and good people. What else do you need?" He'd smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't know. Maybe something bigger." That was the first time I'd felt the distance creeping in, like a crack in a piece of oak you don't notice until it splits wide open. He'd gone off to college not long after, then New York, then Sophia. Each step took him further from the workshop, from me. I stopped at a gas station just over the Maryland border, the kind of place with chipped paint and a flickering neon sign. The clerk, a kid with a quick smile, reminded me of Nathan at 20, all energy and ambition. "Long drive, huh?" he said as I paid for a coffee. "Yeah," I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. "Going to see my son. Too late, though." His smile faltered. "Sorry, man. That's rough. Safe travels." Back in the truck, I sipped the bitter coffee, staring at the photo again. Nathan's grin in that picture was the kind that made you believe anything was possible. I wondered when I'd stopped seeing that grin, when our Sunday phone calls had turned into quick check-ins, his voice clipped, like he was always rushing to somewhere I couldn't follow. The closer I got to New York, the heavier the air felt, like the city itself was pressing down on me. By evening, Manhattan's skyline loomed ahead, a forest of glass and steel that made my little town in Georgia feel like a memory from another life. The freeway signs pointed to places I'd only heard about, Fifth Avenue, Central Park, places Nathan had called home. I followed the GPS to his address, a sleek tower in Manhattan that looked more like a museum than a place people lived. The street was lined with cars that cost more than I'd made in a decade, their polished surfaces reflecting the city lights like mirrors. I parked my dusty pickup between a Bentley and a Tesla, feeling like a stray dog in a show ring. Nathan's building had a doorman in a crisp uniform, his face unreadable as he eyed my work boots and flannel shirt. "Can I help you, sir?" asked, his tone polite but guarded. "I'm here for Nathan Hayes," I said, my voice catching on his name. "I'm his father, Walter." The doorman's expression softened, just a fraction. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Hayes. Mrs. Grant is upstairs. I'll let her know you're here." I waited in the lobby, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the photo of Nathan tucked inside. The place was all marble and glass, with a chandelier that looked like it belonged in a palace. I caught my reflection in a mirrored wall, gray hair, lined face, eyes red from the road, and grief. Not exactly the picture of a Manhattan father-in-law. The elevator dinged, and I stepped out onto Nathan's floor, the penthouse level. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that costs money. I pressed the buzzer by the door, my heart pounding. Like I was a kid asking for a first date. Sophia's voice came through the intercom, sharp as a blade. "What do you want, Walter?" "It's about Nathan," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I drove up from Georgia. We need to talk about the funeral." A long pause, like she was weighing whether I was worth the trouble. "You shouldn't have come," she said finally. "I've got everything under control." "He was my son, Sophia," I said, the words coming out harder than I meant. "I'm not asking for much. Just to say goodbye." Another pause, then the door buzzed open. I stepped into a world that didn't belong to me, a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows, white leather furniture, and artwork that looked like it cost more than my house. Sophia stood in the center of it all, her dark hair pulled back, her black dress probably designed by someone with a name I couldn't pronounce. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, not like a woman who'd just lost her husband. "You look like you've been sleeping in that truck," she said, her eyes raking over me. "It's been a long day," I said, setting my bag down. She didn't offer me a seat, just crossed her arms. "I've already arranged the funeral, the service, the venue, everything. There's nothing for you to do here." "What about the burial?" I asked. "Nathan told me once he wanted to be laid to rest in Georgia by his mom's grave." Her laugh was sharp, like glass breaking. "Nathan wanted cremation. It's cleaner, more practical. You wouldn't understand." "I knew my son for 45 years, I said, my voice low but firm. "You've known him for 5. Her eyes narrowed. "5 years as his wife, Walter. That's worth more than decades of whatever you had." The words cut deep, but I held her gaze. "This isn't about us, Sophia. It's about Nathan." She turned away, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "Fine. The service is Friday, St. James Chapel. Small, private, just close friends. You can come, but don't expect to be part of the planning." The message was clear. I was an outsider, tolerated, but not wanted. I nodded, picking up my bag. "I'll find a motel. Let me know if you change your mind about talking." As I turned to leave, she called after me. "Oh, and Walter? Don't expect a cent of Nathan's $25 million. That's mine to manage now." Her words hung in the air, cold and final. I didn't respond, just walked back to the elevator, feeling her eyes on me like a hawk watching prey. Outside, the city buzzed with life, cars honking, lights flashing. But all I could think about was Nathan, the boy who'd once carved a wooden box for his mom, now lost to a world I'd never understood. I drove to a motel on the edge of the City, a rundown place with a flickering sign that read, Starlight Inn. The room smelled of stale coffee and old carpet, but it was cheap, and nobody cared about my dusty boots. I set Nathan's photo on the bedside table, his young face staring back at me. In the quiet, I pulled out a letter I'd found in my bag while packing, a note Nathan had written years ago when he was still in college. Dad, it read, thanks for teaching me how to build things that last. I'll make you proud someday. I folded the letter carefully, my chest tight. Had he known, even then, that he'd always have a piece of me with him? Or was I just clinging to scraps of a past? That didn't matter anymore. Tomorrow I'd face Sophia again, and whatever came next. But tonight, I lay in that creaky motel bed, the city humming outside, and held onto the memory of my boy, hoping it would give me the strength to keep going. The penthouse door buzzed open, and I stepped into Nathan's world, a place so far. From my Georgia workshop, it might as well have been another planet. The air smelled of expensive perfume and polished wood, the kind of clean that costs more than I'd ever made in a year. Sophia stood in the center of the living room, her arms crossed, her black dress hugging her like it was tailored just for this moment. She didn't smile, didn't offer a handshake or a glass of water. Just fixed me with a look that said I was an inconvenience she'd rather sweep under the rug. You shouldn't have come all this way, Walter, she said, her voice sharp, like a lawyer cross-examining a witness. I've got everything handled for Nathan's service. You didn't need to leave your workshop. He was my son, Sophia, I said, setting my duffel bag down on the marble floor. My boots looked ridiculous against the gleaming surface, like they were trespassing. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to be part of saying goodbye. She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Goodbye? You barely saw him these past 5 years. Why start now? Her words stung, like a splinter you don't see until it's buried deep. She wasn't wrong. I hadn't visited much. Nathan's life had gotten so big, so fast, with his private aviation company and his Manhattan penthouse. I'd felt out of place, like a piece of rough lumber in a showroom of polished mahogany. But that didn't mean I loved him any less. I'm here now, I said, keeping my voice steady. I want to know about the funeral, where it's happening, what Nathan wanted. Sophia turned away, walking toward a massive window that looked out over the city, lights twinkling like stars you could buy. St. James Chapel, Friday at 3. Small, tasteful, just close friends and business associates. I've already picked the flowers, the music, everything. It's under control. What about the burial? I asked, my hands tightening around the strap of my bag. Nathan told me years ago he wanted to be laid to rest in Georgia, next to his mom at Willow Creek Cemetery. Her laugh cut through, the air sharp and brittle like a chisel slipping on hardwood. Burial? Oh, Walter, that's so provincial. Nathan wanted cremation. It's modern, practical. I discussed it with him plenty of times. I felt heat rising in my chest. He told me something different. When he was younger, after Ellen passed, he said he wanted to be near her, said it felt right. Sophia spun around, her eyes narrowing. That was a kid talking, Walter. A kid who didn't know what his life would become. I was his wife. I knew him better than anyone these last 5 years. Trust me, he didn't want some dusty old cemetery in the middle of nowhere. Her words were like a slap, but I held my ground. 5 years as his wife doesn't erase 45 years as his father. I knew my boy. She stepped closer, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down to something ugly. You knew a boy who whittled sticks in your shed. I knew the man who built an empire. There's a difference. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but part of me wondered if she was right. Had I lost touch with the man Nathan had become? Had I let the distance grow because I couldn't keep up with his world? "Look," I said, softening my tone, "this isn't about you and me. It's about Nathan. Can we at least talk about what he would have wanted?" Sophia sighed, like I was a child who didn't understand the rules. "I've already made the calls. The funeral home's set. The guest list is finalized. Only the people who mattered to Nathan's life here. You can come, but don't expect to change anything." "Who's on that guest list?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "What about his old friends from Georgia? Tommy, who he grew up with? Or Sarah, who he used to fish with at the creek?" She waved a hand, dismissive. "Those people haven't seen Nathan in years. They don't belong at a service like this. It's for his real circle, his partners, his clients, the people who understood what he built." I stared at her, the weight of her words settling like dust. She wasn't just planning a funeral. She was rewriting Nathan's life, erasing the parts that didn't fit her polished image. "You can't just cut out his past like that," I said. "Those people knew him before he was this." I gestured at the penthouse, the crystal chandelier, the view of a city that never slept. Sophia's smile was cold, like winter frost, on a window pane. "His past is exactly that, Walter. Past. I'm handling his legacy now, and trust me, I'll make sure it's done right." I wanted to argue, to tell her that Nathan's legacy wasn't just money and skyscrapers, but the boy who'd carved a wooden box for his mom, who'd laughed until he couldn't breathe when we got stuck in the mud during a hunting trip. But the look in her eyes told me she wouldn't listen. To her, I was just an old man from Georgia, a relic who didn't belong in her world. "Fine," I said, picking up my bag. "I'll be at the service. But I'm not here for you, Sophia. I'm here for my son." She didn't respond, just watched me as I walked back to the door. As it closed behind me, I heard her heels clicking away, like she was already moving on to the next item on her checklist. Back in my truck, I drove through Manhattan's crowded streets, the city's noise a stark contrast to the quiet of my workshop. I found the Starlight Inn again, its neon sign flickering like it was on its last legs. The clerk handed me a key to room 14, and I hauled my bag inside, the room smelling of mildew and cheap air freshener. I set Nathan's photo on the nightstand, his 12-year-old smile a lifeline in this strange place. Then I pulled out the letter I'd found while packing, the one he'd written in college. I read it again, my eyes tracing his messy handwriting. "Dad, thanks for teaching me how to build things that last. I'll make you proud someday." My throat tightened. Had he thought he hadn't made me proud? I'd always been proud. Maybe too proud to say it enough. I'd thought there'd be time, more Sundays to call, more visits to plan. Now, time was gone. And all I had left was this trip to New York and a funeral Sophia wanted to control. I lay on the creaky bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Somewhere in this city, Sophia was making calls, crossing names off lists, shaping Nathan's goodbye into something that suited her. I thought about the letter again, and a memory flickered. Nathan, maybe 25, calling me from New York after his first big deal. "Dad, I just sold my first plane lease," he'd said, his voice crackling with excitement like when he'd finished that birdhouse. "It's $1 million deal. Can you believe it?" "That's more money than I'll see in a lifetime, son," I'd said, half laughing, elbow deep in sawdust in the workshop. "You should come home, "Show me what you're building up there." He'd promised to visit, but he never did. Work got busy. Sophia came into the picture, and our calls got shorter, less frequent. I'd let it happen, told myself he was living his dream. But lying there in that motel room, I wondered if I'd let him drift too far. The next morning, I woke to the sound of city traffic, horns blaring like they were angry at the world. I pulled on a clean shirt, ran a hand through my gray hair, and looked at Nathan's photo. "I'm doing this for you, son," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I drove back to the penthouse, hoping Sophia might have softened overnight. When I buzzed the intercom, her voice came through, just as cold as before. "What now, Walter?" "I just want to help with the arrangements," I said. "Anything you need, I'm here." "I told you it's handled," she snapped. "The service is set, the cremation's scheduled. You don't need to be involved." "Cremation?" I said, my voice rising despite myself. "Sophia, Nathan wanted to be buried in Georgia. You can't just—" "I can, and I will," she cut me off. "This is my decision now. You should go back to your little town. There's nothing for you here." The intercom went silent, and I stood there, staring at the sleek metal gate. My hands shook, not just with grief, but with a kind of anger I hadn't felt in years. She was erasing Nathan, piece by piece, and I was just supposed to stand by and let it happen. I climbed back into my truck, the photo of Nathan still on the passenger seat. I touched the chipped frame, remembering the day he'd made that birdhouse, how he'd run to show Ellen, his eyes shining. Sophia could control the funeral, the guest list, even the story she told about Nathan's life, but she couldn't take those memories from me. I drove back to the motel, the city blurring past like a dream I didn't want to be in. Friday was 2 days away, and I'd be at that chapel, no matter what Sophia said. I owed Nathan that much. But as I parked outside the Starlight Inn, a thought gnawed at me. What if Sophia wasn't just controlling the funeral? What if she was planning to control everything Nathan had left behind? In my room, I pulled out the letter again, reading that one line over and over. "Thanks for teaching me how to build things that last." There was something in those words, something I couldn't quite grasp yet, like a knot in a piece of wood you don't see until you start carving. I didn't know what Nathan had left behind, but I was starting to think Sophia knew more than she was letting on. The morning of Nathan's funeral dawned gray and heavy, the kind of New York sky that seemed to press down on you, like it knew the weight of what was coming. I stood in the motel room at the Starlight Inn, staring at my reflection in a cracked mirror. My one good suit, bought second-hand for Ellen's funeral years ago, hung a little loose on my frame. I straightened the black tie, my hands clumsy from lack of sleep. The photo of Nathan, that 12-year-old kid with his birdhouse, sat on the nightstand, his smile a quiet anchor in the storm of this day. I drove to St. James Chapel, the city's noise fading into a dull hum as I parked my pickup among sleek black sedans and limousines. The chapel was a grand old building, all stone and stained glass, the kind of place that felt more like a museum than a house of grief. I stepped inside, my work boots echoing on the polished floor, and felt every eye turn toward me. Men in tailored suits, women in designer black dresses, their faces arranged in careful masks of sympathy. I didn't belong here, and they knew it. Sophia held court near the front, surrounded by a cluster of people who looked like they'd stepped out of a boardroom. She was flawless in her black dress, her makeup so precise it could have been painted on by an artist. She dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, but there wasn't a smudge on her face. It was a performance, and she was the star. I signed the guest book with a pen that felt too heavy, my name, Walter Hayes, looking out of place among the elegant signatures above it. I took a seat in the back row, the wooden pew creaking under me. From here, I could watch without being part of the show. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, their sweetness cloying, almost suffocating. Whispers floated around me, snippets of conversation that weren't meant for my ears. Such a tragedy, a woman in pearls said to Sophia, her voice soft but practiced. Nathan was so young. Sophia nodded, her handkerchief brushing her cheek. He worked so hard. His heart just couldn't keep up with his ambition. Her voice broke just enough to sound convincing, but I'd seen enough of her to know it was calculated. A man in a pinstripe suit approached, his hand on Sophia's arm. If you need help with Nathan's company, Sophia, just say the word. Those contracts, the fleet, he built something incredible. You're too kind, Richard, she said, her smile small but deliberate. I'll be handling everything personally. Everything personally. Like Nathan's life was a business deal she'd inherited along with his death. I watched her move through the crowd, accepting condolences like a queen receiving tribute. These people didn't know Nathan. Not the boy who'd carved a birdhouse. Not the teenager who'd spent hours sanding wood in my workshop. They knew a name on a contract, a face at a gala. To them, he was a success story, not a son. Then I heard her voice drop, low and conspiratorial, meant to be private, but carrying just far enough. Look at that old man in the back, she murmured to a blonde woman in a sleek black dress. Nathan was embarrassed by him. The blonde, Clara, I think her name was, glanced my way, her eyes flickering with pity. Sophia, he's grieving too. He's Nathan's father. He barely visited, Sophia said, her voice like venom wrapped in silk. Now he wants to play the devoted dad? Nathan told me his father never got his world. Always made him feel like he'd betrayed something by succeeding. Her words hit like a hammer on a nail, driving deep. I hadn't made Nathan feel ashamed, had I? I'd been proud, so proud, of everything he'd built. Maybe I hadn't said it enough, hadn't known how to bridge the gap between my workshop and his skyscrapers. But ashamed? No, that wasn't true. I stood, the pew creaking again, and the whispers around me stopped. Sophia's eyes met mine across the room, and for a moment, her mask slipped. Just a flicker of unease before she smoothed it back into place. I walked toward her, my steps slow, deliberate, every eye in the chapel following me. Sophia, I said, my voice low but steady, this isn't the place. Today's about Nathan, not us. Her lips tightened, but she recovered quickly, her voice dripping with false sincerity. Of course, Walter, we're all just emotional. You understand? Clara shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting away, like she'd been caught in something ugly. The people around us went quiet, waiting for a scene, but I wasn't here to give them one. I nodded and returned to my seat, the weight of their stares heavy on my back. The minister stepped to the podium, his voice smooth and practiced. Nathan Hayes was a man who valued achievement and connection, he began, reading from notes that had to have come from Sophia. He built not just a business empire, but a legacy of relationships. I stared at the closed casket up front, draped in white lilies. That wasn't Nathan. Not the boy who'd laughed when he got sawdust in his hair, who'd asked me if he'd ever be as good a carpenter as his dad. Somewhere between those Georgia summers and this marble chapel, I'd lost him to a world that measured worth in dollars and deals. The service dragged on with hymns Nathan never sang, readings from books he'd never opened. Sophia's sobs came right on cue during the eulogy, perfectly timed for maximum effect. I sat there, hands clasped tight, trying to hold on to the Nathan I knew, not the version Sophia was selling. When it was time to pay respects, I waited until the end, letting the crowd file past the casket first. Their murmurs filled the chapel, business talk, plans for lunch, anything but real grief. Finally, it was just me, standing alone by Nathan's casket. The lilies were overwhelming now, their scent choking the air. I touched the smooth wood of the casket, my fingers tracing the grain like it was one of my own projects. "I'm sorry, son," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I should have come up here more. Should have told you how proud I was." I let her push me away, and I didn't fight hard enough to stay in your life. The words spilled out, things I'd meant to say for years but never did. I thought of that birdhouse, the one he'd made for Ellen, still sitting on her dresser back home. I thought of the letter in my bag, his college scrawl promising to make me proud. Had he known how much he already had? I stood there a long time, the chapel silent except for the faint hum of the organ. Outside I could hear car doors slamming, engines starting, life moving on. Sophia was already out there, surrounded by her entourage, probably planning her next move. I caught a glimpse of her through the stained glass window, checking her reflection in a compact mirror, her face composed, like grief was just another role to play. I walked out to my truck, the photo of Nathan in my pocket, its chipped frame pressing against my side. The funeral procession was forming, a line of sleek cars headed to a crematorium Sophia had chosen. I climbed into my pickup, the engine coughing to life, and followed at a distance. My stomach twisted as I thought about Nathan's wish to be buried by Ellen in Georgia. Was Sophia right? Had he changed his mind, or was she rewriting his story to suit her? As we drove through the city, I remembered something else, a conversation from years ago when Nathan was home for Christmas. He'd been quiet, sitting by the fire in my living room, the glow catching the lines on his face. "Dad," he'd said, "if anything ever happens to me, make sure I'm laid to rest with Mom. It's where I belong." I'd brushed it off, then told him he was too young to talk like that. But now, that memory felt like a promise I had to keep. Sophia could control the guest list, the flowers, the music, but she couldn't take that from me. When we reached the crematorium, I stayed in my truck watching Sophia and her crowd file inside. They moved like they were at a business meeting, not a goodbye. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Something wasn't right. Sophia was too confident, too quick to move on, like she already knew what came next. I reached into my bag and pulled out Nathan's letter again, unfolding it carefully. "Thanks for teaching me how to build things that last," he'd written. There was something in those words, something bigger than I'd realized. I didn't know what yet, but I was starting to think Nathan had left me more than just memories. The lawyer's office was on the 43rd floor of a glass tower in Manhattan, the kind of place that made you feel small just stepping out of the elevator. The conference room was all polished wood and leather, with windows showing a city that stretched out like a map of someone else's life. I sat at the end of a long mahogany table, my hands folded, still rough from years of sanding wood. My suit felt like it was wearing me, not the other way around, and I kept my old baseball cap in my lap, a reminder of where I came from. Sophia, sat at the head of the table like she was running a board meeting, not mourning her husband. Her black dress was as perfect as ever, her posture straight, her hands folded just so. She didn't look at me, just stared out the window, her reflection sharp against the glass. A few others were there, Nathan's cousin, Emily from Atlanta, and a business partner, Tom, who kept checking his watch. They looked uncomfortable, like they knew something was about to break. The lawyer, Margaret Cole, walked in, her silver hair pulled back, her suit probably worth more than my truck. She had the calm of someone who'd seen 100 family fights like this one. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice steady, professional. "I know this is a difficult time." Sophia smoothed her dress, a small smile playing on her lips, like she was already counting the millions she thought were hers. "Let's get this over with," she said, her tone clipped. "I have a lot to manage after today." Margaret nodded, unfazed, and opened a thick folder, the pages crisp with legal weight. I shifted in my seat, the leather creaking under me. I didn't expect anything from Nathan's estate. Sophia had made that clear from the start. I was here for him, to hear his final words, even if they didn't include me. "Walter," Sophia said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "You don't need to stay. I told you. Don't expect a cent of Nathan's $25 million. It's mine to handle." Her words were cold, final, like she was closing a case in one of her courtrooms. I started to stand, my cap clutched tight, but something made me pause. Maybe it was the letter in my pocket, Nathan's college scrawl promising to make me proud. Maybe it was the memory of his voice, telling me he wanted to be buried by his mom. Whatever it was, I sat back down. "I just want to hear what Nathan wanted," I said, my voice low but firm. Sophia's eyes narrowed. "His wishes were clear. He provided for me. That's a wife's right." She leaned toward Emily, her voice dropping but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is just a formality. Nathan told me he'd taken care of everything." Margaret cleared her throat, adjusting her glasses. "Let's begin." She opened the first document, the paper crackling, like it carried the weight of the world. "This is the last will and testament of Nathan James Hayes, dated February 10th, 2025. Sophia leaned forward, her wedding ring glinting in the afternoon light, her face a picture of confidence. I sat back, bracing myself for the inevitable. Nathan's fortune, his company, his life, all handed to Sophia, the woman who'd shaped his world these past 5 years. Margaret's voice was steady, cutting through the silence. "After careful consideration of my assets and relationships, I make the following bequests." She paused, flipping to the next page. "To my cousin, Emily Hayes, I leave my vintage watch collection, valued at approximately $20,000. Emily nodded, her eyes misty but grateful. Sophia's smile grew, like she was checking off a list in her head. Each small gift, a step closer to the real prize. "To my business partner, Tom Reynolds, I leave my shares in the East Coast Aviation Project, valued at approximately $150,000. Tom gave a tight nod, his face unreadable. Sophia's fingers tapped the table, her confidence filling the room like a storm cloud. I could almost see her calculating, picturing the millions about to be hers. Margaret turned another page, and something in her posture shifted, just a slight stiffening, like she was bracing for impact. "To my beloved father, Walter Hayes," she read, her voice steady but deliberate. "I leave the majority of my estate, including all business interests, stock portfolios, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $24 million. The room went still, like the air had been sucked out. Sophia's face froze, her eyes wide, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. My heart stopped, then thudded hard against my ribs. 24 million. The number was so big it didn't feel real. Like something you'd hear in a movie, not in your own life. That's impossible, Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible, her hands gripping the table's edge. Margaret kept reading, as if she hadn't heard. To my wife, Sophia Grant, I leave the Brooklyn apartment, valued at approximately $700,000, along with all furnishings and personal effects contained therein. Sophia's breath hitched, her face draining of color. No, she said louder. Now, her voice cracking. That can't be right. Check it again. I sat there, my hands shaking, trying to make sense of it. $24 million. Why would Nathan do this? We hadn't been close these last years. Our calls short, our visits rare. I'd been proud of him, but I'd stayed in Georgia, in my workshop, while he built his empire here. Why me? Margaret folded her hands, her voice calm but firm. The will was properly executed and witnessed, Mrs. Grant. These are Nathan's legal wishes. Sophia's eyes darted to me, sharp and accusing. You did this, she hissed. You manipulated him, didn't you? Got to him when he was stressed, made him feel guilty about leaving you behind. Sophia, I didn't know, I said, my voice rough with shock. I had no idea he— Liar, she snapped, standing so fast her chair scraped against the floor. You always resented me, resented what Nathan became. You guilted him into this. Emily and Tom exchanged uneasy glances, the room thick with tension. Margaret raised a hand, her tone cutting through like a judge's gavel. Mrs. Grant, please, this is not the time. Sophia's chest heaved, her composure crumbling like a poorly joined piece of wood. This is fraud, she said, her voice rising. I was his wife. I built this life with him. I deserve— The will is clear, Margaret interrupted, her eyes steady. Nathan made his choices. Sophia sank back into her chair, her hands trembling, her face a mix of rage and disbelief. I looked at my hands, calloused from years of carving, and tried to wrap my head around it. $24 million is more money than I could imagine, let alone manage. Why, Nathan? What were you thinking? Margaret slid a small envelope across the table to me, her expression softening. Nathan left this for you, Mr. Hayes. A personal letter, to be read after the will. I took the envelope, my fingers brushing the paper. Nathan's handwriting was on the front, my name in his familiar scrawl. I didn't open it, not yet. It felt too heavy, like it held answers I wasn't ready for. Sophia stood again, grabbing her purse like it was a lifeline. This isn't over, she said, her voice low and dangerous. I'll see you in court, Walter. No judge will believe Nathan chose you over me. She stormed out, her heels echoing like gunshots in the quiet room. Emily and Tom mumbled excuses and followed, leaving me alone with Margaret. I sat there, the envelope in my hands, the weight of $24 million pressing down on me like a stack of uncut timber. Mr. Hayes, Margaret said gently, this might get complicated. Sophia's a lawyer. She won't let this go easily. I nodded, still staring at the envelope. I didn't ask for this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to say goodbye to my boy. I know, she said. But Nathan clearly wanted you to have this. There's a reason for it. I tucked the envelope into my pocket, next to the photo of Nathan and his birdhouse. The city hummed outside, 43 floors below, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shaken my world. Sophia was out there, probably already calling her lawyer friends, planning her next move. And me? I was an old carpenter from Georgia, holding a fortune I didn't understand, and a letter that might hold the key to why. As I left the office, the envelope felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. I didn't know what Nathan had written, but I knew one thing. Whatever was in that letter, it was going to change everything. The Los Angeles County Superior Court loomed like a fortress, its marble steps cold under my worn boots as I walked up them 3 weeks after the will reading. The city felt even more foreign now, its noise and rush a constant reminder that I was out of my element. But Henry, my old friend from Georgia, was by my side, his weathered hand steady on my shoulder. "You've got this, Walter," he said. His voice rough but sure. "Nathan's truth is on your side." Inside, courtroom 312 smelled of polished wood and old paper, like a library where lives were decided. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and gray hair pulled tight, sat behind the bench, her presence commanding the room. Margaret Cole, my lawyer, sat beside me, her calm a quiet anchor in the storm. Across the aisle, Sophia was with her lawyer, Margaret Klein, a woman with a reputation for tearing apart wills like a hawk tears into prey. Sophia's face was a mask of determination, her eyes avoiding mine, like I was a problem she could will away. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your heartbeat sound too loud. I clutched the envelope with Nathan's letter in my pocket, its weight a reminder of why I was here. I wasn't fighting for the money, not really. I was fighting for my son, for what he'd wanted, for the truth he'd left behind. Margaret. Klein stood first, her voice smooth and sharp, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is about a vulnerable man, Nathan Hayes, manipulated by his father during a time of stress and doubt. Walter Hayes preyed on his son's guilt, convincing him to redirect a fortune he didn't deserve." Her words hit like a punch, painting me as some kind of schemer. I felt Henry tense beside me, his jaw tight. Sophia sat straight, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the grieving widow to perfection. But I'd seen her real face, the one that laughed at me in Nathan's penthouse, the one that called me an embarrassment. Margaret Cole rose, her voice steady, factual. "Your Honor, Nathan Hayes was of sound mind when he executed his will 3 months before his death. He made a deliberate choice to provide for his father, and no evidence of undue influence exists beyond Mrs. Grant's disappointment." The judge nodded, her face unreadable, and called Sophia to the stand. She walked up, her heels clicking, her posture perfect, like she was arguing a case in her own courtroom. Klein guided her through a story that twisted my stomach. "Nathan was under so much pressure," Sophia said, her voice breaking just enough to sound real. His company was facing lawsuits, and he felt guilty about drifting away from his father. Walter's calls always left him upset, like he'd failed as a son. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. That wasn't true. Our calls had been short, awkward sometimes, but I'd never guilted him. I just wanted to hear his voice, to know he was okay. Klein leaned in, her tone gentle but pointed. "Did Walter ever ask Nathan for money or favors?" "No," Sophia said, her eyes flickering to me, sharp and accusing. "But he didn't have to. He'd call, talk about the past, make Nathan feel like he'd abandoned his roots. It was emotional manipulation, plain and simple." The words stung because they carried a sliver of truth. Not about manipulation, but about the distance between us. I hadn't visited enough, hadn't pushed past Sophia's walls to stay in Nathan's life, but I hadn't schemed for his money. I hadn't even known he had that much. When it was my turn, I walked to the stand, my hands shaking as I swore to tell the truth. The courtroom felt like a spotlight, every eye measuring me against Sophia's story. Margaret Cole's voice was kind, grounding. "Mr. Hayes, how often did you see Nathan in the years before his death?" "Maybe 3 times in 5 years," I admitted, my voice rough. "We talked on the phone, holidays, birthdays, but I didn't come up much." Sophia made it clear I wasn't welcome. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Klein objected, but the judge waved it off. "Did you ever ask Nathan for money?" Margaret continued. "Never," I said, meeting her eyes. "I didn't know he had $25 million. I just knew he was my son, and I was proud of him." Klein's cross-examination was brutal, her questions like chisels chipping away at me. "Isn't it true, Mr. Hayes, that you resented Nathan's success? That you disapproved of his marriage to Sophia?" I took a breath, looking straight at Sophia. I didn't resent his success. I was proud. Maybe too proud to say it enough. As for Sophia, I thought she married him for his money. Looks like I wasn't wrong. The gallery stirred, a low hum of surprise. Klein's eyes narrowed, but the judge's face stayed impassive. I'd said what I felt, plain and honest, the way I'd always lived. Next came the notary who'd witnessed Nathan's will, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense air. "Nathan was clear-headed," she said. "He read every page, asked questions about the wording. He knew exactly what he was doing. Medical records showed Nathan was in good health, mentally sharp, until the day he died. Phone logs proved. I hadn't called him as often as Sophia claimed. No barrage of guilt trips, just a few short calls, mostly for birthdays and Christmas." Margaret Cole presented Nathan's letter, the one he'd left for me, though she didn't read it aloud. "This letter," she said, "confirms Nathan's intent to provide for his father, written in his own hand." Klein's closing argument was a desperate plea, leaning hard on emotion. Don't let a grieving widow be robbed of her rightful inheritance by a man who abandoned his son for years, only to swoop in when money was on the table. Margaret Cole's response was simple, direct. Nathan Hayes made a choice. The evidence shows he was competent, his wishes clear. This court should honor his will, not overturn it based on speculation. The judge recessed, her voice steady but heavy. "I'll review the evidence overnight and deliver my ruling tomorrow at 10. We filed out, the courtroom's silence following us into the hall. Sophia caught my arm as I passed, her grip tight, her voice low and venomous. "This isn't over, Walter. You'll never be worthy of what Nathan built." I looked at her, my heart heavy but my resolve firm. "Nathan made his choice, Sophia. Maybe it's time you accept it." She pulled away, her eyes blazing, and stormed off with Klein trailing behind, already talking strategy. Henry clapped a hand on my back as we walked to my truck. "You did good in there," he said. "Stood tall, like Nathan would have wanted." I nodded, but doubt gnawed at me. Had I somehow pushed Nathan into this? Had my silence, my staying in Georgia, made him feel he owed me something? I pulled the letter from my pocket, still unopened. I hadn't been able to read it yet, afraid of what it might say, afraid it might confirm Sophia's accusations. Back at the Starlight Inn, I sat on the edge of the motel bed, the letter in my hands. Henry was across the room, unpacking his suitcase. his presence a quiet comfort. "You gonna read that?" he asked, nodding at the envelope. "Not yet," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if she's right, Henry? What if I did something to make Nathan feel guilty?" Henry shook his head, his eyes kind but firm. "Walter, you raised a good man. Whatever's in that letter, it's what Nathan wanted you to know. Don't let Sophia's lies make you doubt that." I nodded, but the weight of the letter felt heavier than ever. Outside, the city hummed, its lights flickering through the motel's thin curtains. Tomorrow, the judge would decide whether Nathan's will would stand or fall to Sophia's challenge. I lay back, the springs creaking under me, and stared at the ceiling, the letter beside me like a question I wasn't ready to answer. But as I drifted towards sleep, one thought kept circling. Nathan had chosen me. Not Sophia, not his business partners, not his New York life. Me. And whatever was in that letter, it was his voice, speaking to me one last time. I just had to find the courage to listen. The courtroom felt different that morning, charged with the weight of a decision that would change everything. I sat in the same wooden chair, my hands folded, Nathan's letter still unopened in my pocket. Henry sat beside me, his steady presence like an old oak tree, unwavering through the storm. Across the aisle, Sophia and her lawyer, Margaret Klein, were huddled in quiet conversation, her face drawn, the strain of the past weeks showing in the lines her makeup couldn't hide. I didn't feel triumph, just a heavy kind of hope that Nathan's wishes would stand. Judge Thompson entered, her gray hair catching the morning light, her expression as unreadable as ever. The room fell silent, every breath held, waiting for her words. "After careful review of the evidence and testimony," she began, her voice steady, "this court finds the will of Nathan James Hayes to be legally valid and executed with full mental competency." A sharp gasp cut through the silence. Sophia, her hand flying to her chest. Klein's face stayed neutral, but I saw her eyes flicker, already calculating an appeal. My heart thudded, a mix of relief and disbelief. $24 million. Nathan's choice, upheld. The testator clearly intended to leave his estate to his father, the judge continued. No credible evidence of undue influence has been presented. The will stands as written. Case dismissed. Her gavel fell, the sound sharp and final, like a hammer driving a nail home. I sat there, stunned, the weight of it all settling over me. Henry clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grin wide. "Justice won, Walter. Nathan would be proud." Sophia stood, her face a storm of fury and defeat. She stormed toward me in the hallway, her heels clicking like gunfire. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You'll never deserve what Nathan built. I'll appeal this until—" "Sophia," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "Nathan made his choice. Maybe it's time you let him go." Her eyes blazed, but something in them cracked, like a piece of wood under too much strain. "He never would have chosen you if you hadn't poisoned him against me," she said, but her voice lacked the fire it once had. She turned and walked away, Klein trailing behind, already talking about next steps. I watched her go, knowing she'd never surrender, but also knowing she'd lost something she couldn't get back. Henry and I drove to the airport to see him off, the city's noise fading as we reached LAX. His gait felt like the end of a long road we'd traveled together. "You did right by your boy," he said, gripping my shoulder. "Whatever comes next, you've got his trust." "I still don't get why he did it," I admitted, my voice thick. $24 million to an old man who barely called. Henry's eyes softened, wise in the way only decades of friendship can bring. Maybe he saw what I've always seen. A man who builds things to last, who loved him for who he was, not what he had. I nodded, the letter in my pocket feeling heavier than ever. We said our goodbyes, and I watched Henry disappear into the crowd, his words echoing in my mind. The drive back to Georgia stretched ahead, 14 hours to think, to feel, to finally face what Nathan had left me. Somewhere around the South Carolina border, I pulled over at a rest stop, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in shades of gold. I took out the letter, my hands trembling as I broke the seal. Nathan's handwriting spilled across the page, his voice coming alive in every word. "Dad," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry for all the times I didn't call, didn't visit. You taught me how to build things that last, not just with wood, but with love. I got caught up in this world, jets, deals, Sophia's ambition, but I never forgot you. You loved me when I was just a kid with a hammer, not a dollar to my name. That's why I'm leaving you my estate, not just to protect you, but to protect what we had, the workshop, the land, our home. Keep it alive, Dad. Make something that lasts." Tears blurred the words, and I sat there, the letter shaking in my hands. Nathan hadn't left me money to fix a mistake or ease his guilt. He'd left it because he trusted me to carry on what mattered most, the life we'd built together in Georgia, the love that outlasted distance and time. Sophia's world, all flash and deals, couldn't touch that. Back in my workshop 3 days later, I stood among the tools and sawdust, the air thick with the scent of cedar. Nathan's photo was back on the wall, his 12-year-old smile brighter now, like he'd known I'd understand. Beside it, I'd hung the letter, framed in a simple oak frame I'd carved myself. I ran my hand over the workbench, thinking about what Nathan had written. This workshop, this land, it was ours, a legacy stronger than any skyscraper. I'd use the money to keep it going, maybe start a carpentry school for kids like Nathan used to be, teach them how to build something real. Outside, the Georgia sky stretched wide, endless and full of possibility. For the first time in months, the grief felt lighter, like a piece of wood sanded smooth. Nathan hadn't just given me money. He'd given me back our connection, a reminder that love doesn't fade, even when life pulls you apart. And there's a lesson in that, one I've carried since. The things that last aren't built with money or ambition, but with love, trust, and the kind of truth you can hold in your hands, like a well-crafted piece of wood. Nathan knew that, and in the end, he made sure I did too.